of the Mind Grinders podcast, your podcast focused on the modern player, and more so today, the modern miller. This is Shaf, aka That Mill Guy, coming at you with a solo episode of the podcast, not joined by my usual co-host Blitz, aka Jack, or Blitz MTG, aka Jack, or however you want to say it. Blitz is busy with life and wanted to use his free time to focus on himself, which is probably the best thing that anyone can do in life, instead of just recording this garbage on the internet. Shout out to you, Blitz. You're doing God's work. Now, this episode is going to be focused on providing a soft primer, an audible version, I should say, of a mill primer, something that any listener can listen in on, obviously, for themselves, and as well as pass on to any friends, family, or partners, individuals in their lives that want to get into Modern Mill as a deck and an archetype to play in the modern format. There's obviously Mill in various other formats, but Modern Mill is truly where this archetype shines and stays the most unique. So I wanted to take this opportunity again to provide that primer, to provide an understanding of what is Modern Mill, what can you do with Modern Mill, what are the pros and cons, why should you play Modern Mill, all these questions and more. Hopefully I can answer throughout the rest of this episode. Now, I want to get into some caveats here. So caveats being that I'm going to be primarily focusing on Modern Dimir Mill. Now, Dimir Mill is where Modern Mill truly started as an archetype, something that started to fashion itself and solidify what it can and can't do. There are archetypes such as Esper Mill, Azorius Mill, Sultai Mill. These truly deserve their own episodes and a kind of a back and forth with players that have played these archetypes and shouldn't be something for a solo operation like myself here on this episode. So we're going to leave those behind. We're going to be focusing on Dimir Mill. Secondly, the next caveat is going to be, again, modern format. I am going to be bringing up cards that may see play in other formats in Mill, currently in Standard, whatever it might be. I might bring those up, but I want to try and make this episode as evergreen as possible. And so we're going to be talking about cards that are currently legal in Modern, might reference some cards that have been played in past years in Modern, and again, just try and create that all-encompassing picture. The third caveat that I want to bring up is going to be the fact that, again, for you more enfranchised players, this might be not the most informative episode, but it's going to be an episode that helps solidify some concepts that you might be unsure of or disprove some beliefs that you might have. There's been a lot of conversations, as of the recording of this episode, there's been a lot of conversations around Mill, and a lot of people that are good at Magic shouting shouting lies, I should say. I'm going to be honest about it. Not knowing what they're talking about in any way, shape, or form, and misinforming the larger modern community about what Mill is in general. And I think it's my job as a Mill content creator and as a modern player that's been playing Mill for the better part of 3 to 4 years to help inform the masses and help you solidify some concepts. A lot of you may disagree. A lot of you more enfranchised Modern players or Mill players may disagree. And I'm the type of person who will make comments and am more than happy to get called out on. If you think something I've said in this episode is wrong, please find me on my socials, links down below, on my Twitter, on my YouTube channel, on the Mill Discord. Give me a shout out. Let me know what I said wrong. Let me know what you think. And I'm more than happy to discuss that and maybe in a follow-up episode of the pod, address that as well if it was something that bad. But let's hop right into it with number one, the first topic that I should get into, and that's going to be, what is Modern Mill? Now, Modern Mill is a tempo mid-range archetype, mid-range tempo, whatever it is. An archetype that looks to take advantage of Magic Rule 121.4. Now, there's another rule and potentially others. I don't know the complete Magic history. 104.3a, 3c, sorry, that states this similar rule as well. But 121.4 in the Magic Comprehensive Rule says, a player who attempts to draw a card from a library with no cards in it loses the game the next time a player would receive priority. Now, that gets into the deeper concept of state-based actions, whatever priority. It doesn't matter. If you draw from an empty library, you lose the game. This is a very similar concept across most card games. If you draw from an empty library, you lose the game unless there's an effect on the battlefield or in the game that says otherwise. And this is something that's originally come from Magic in a lot of ways. This is something that's come from Magic and transferred outside of. And again, Mill takes advantage of this by playing cards that remove cards from its opponent's library, whether that be through exiling, through now a keyworded mechanic, milling, as in putting those cards into the graveyard, and eventually making it so there are no cards in an opponent's library, so that when they go to draw, when they go to cast their draw spell, when they draw on their upkeep, they lose the game. Now, one thing I want to get into, this might even be caveat number 5, whatever it is. Modern Mill is no longer, and has not been for a very while, it is not a burn archetype. This archetype is not comparable to burn. This archetype is actually much closer to a combo control archetype. And that lends to some of the power of the strategy. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're going to be talking about key cards such as Archive Trap and Drown in the Lock to help hone in that concept. But the one thing I want you to remember is we are closer, if you are familiar with the Pioneer format and in previous metas, we are closer to Inverter combo in Pioneer than we are to Modern Burn, and that has been true for many years. People have been stating us as similar to Modern Burn, and unfortunately, they don't know what they're talking about. They have not put in the time and effort to play this deck or play it in depth, and unfortunately, that's just misinforming the masses. I'm just going to state it like it is. And again, we're going to be going through some cards and explaining why that's true, because it's really going to help you to understand some of the key plays, some of the ways that these cards are sequenced, so that you can make sure this concept sticks to you and can help you understand observing a battlefield, observing a game state, and observing a matchup when you go to play with Modern Mill. Now that we have the definition out of the way as to what the archetype does, we put cards in people's graveyards or in exile and just get them to 0. Let's get into why you would want to play Modern Mill. Now, Modern Mill is truly the most unique strategy in the Modern format. And I say that because it's a deck that does not play to life totals. If you think about a combo strategy like, a combo strategy such as Modern Storm, that's a combo deck, but it still plays to 20 life. It'll still cast enough spells in order in one turn so that they can cast a storm spell such as Grape Shot to deal 20 damage to an opponent's face. That's still playing to 20. Obviously, we can think of strategies such as Amulet Titan, which hopes to leverage Amulet of Vigor to play a bunch of lands, play Primeval Titan. It can seem like a fun, goldfishy, combo-style, hyper-synergistic deck, but again, at the end of the day, it is a creature strategy that is hoping to attack your opponent's life total for 20. Heck, even Tron is trying to do the same thing. Tron is trying to leverage 3 lands that creates exorbitant amounts of mana, where they can then cast large permanents and threats that create such overwhelming value that obviously your opponent concedes, but ultimately if your opponent doesn't concede, they do have to take your life total from 20 to 0, or no matter how many times you restart the game with Karn Liberated, you still have to get your opponent from 20 to 0. Decks like Mill don't care about that. We care about an opponent's library. And if you wanted to take a different approach to attacking the Modern meta, then that is going to be a reason why you want to play Modern Mill. If you are tired of playing the regular Dragon's Rage Channeler, attack your opponent over and over again, tempo style strategy, that's going to be another reason why you want to attack a Modern meta with Mill. We offer such unique interactions in the format, and I'm going to be talking about cards like Surgical Extraction as a card that no deck has been able to properly leverage like Modern Mill has. The deck that has come closest is the Faithless Looting era of Modern, where Izzet Phoenix was a deck. Izzet Phoenix for the mirror would actually mainboard in some case Surgical Extraction. And that was the next closest deck that could actually leverage Surgical Extraction as the most unique way to interact with the Modern format. And we're going to, again, go into individual cards in a second. But finally, the last thing I want to list is if you wanted to play some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. That's right, in Magic's history. I'm talking about arguably, in my opinion, the most powerful card in Magic's printing. Not Black Lotus, arguably you could say it is, but Ancestral Recall. If you wanted to play Ancestral Recall in Modern, literally 1 blue, draw 3, you need to play Modern Mill. And we'll get into that in a second. Stay tuned, folks. Now that's why you would want to. Now what are some reasons why you wouldn't want to play Modern Mill? Because I got to do that justice as well. Now, being a control combo mid-range style strategy, there's a lot of flaws to the deck. It's a type of strategy that, again, because we don't play to the axis that other decks are good at playing, we have to work extra hard and play very unique and extreme pieces of interaction and lines of play just to get something going for us. Unfortunately, for cards such as Planeswalkers, we don't have the excuse of, oh, they have a Planeswalker, I'm just going to fly over it with the Murktide Regent and attack them and kill it. We have to play cards that answer all permanents, not just creatures, to deal with that. And then even creatures themselves, such as Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, we don't have the luxury of saying, I have a better one-drop threat. I can just block Ragavan. Unfortunately, we have to play threats that answer Ragavan and also other permanents. So there's a lot of weaknesses in terms of what answers and what cards we have available to us. Also, there's a lot of strategies hoping to attack our life totals, and we can't necessarily race that sometimes because of the fact that we are playing to, if you want to think about it, a 60-point life total in a weird way, and they're playing at a 20. So naturally, if you want to make the old comparisons of how Mill is Burn, then we're playing to a 60-point life total, and again, like I said, they're playing to a 20. They're usually going to be able to beat us in that aspect, so we have to play extreme ways to make things work in our favor. Usually we do end up losing to opposing mid-range strategies. I'm thinking of Boomer Jund with Liliana the Veil and Bloodbraid Elf. We also lose to very extreme low-to-the-ground aggro strategies such as Burn, just because the payoffs that are offered to us in Dimir don't really line up with some of these things that they're doing to us, casting multiple lightning bolts to our face. Unfortunately, some of the cards that I'm going to list don't really answer that too well. So again, there are some weaknesses. But one thing that you know what? We're not even going to go into it. I'm going to go into it when we specifically talk about surgical extraction. Some of you might even be thinking about this right now about combo decks and fragile combo decks. We'll get into that with surgical extraction. Anyway, those are the pros and cons. In terms of what Modern Mill costs, because obviously this is going to be a very interesting conversation considering the price of current Modern. Now, Modern itself is a very expensive format as the recording of this video. Obviously, Modern Horizons 2, Modern Horizons 1 has created an environment that has caused rotation. And a lot of these archetypes in Modern are extremely expensive and upwards of $800, $1,000, $1,500 even. What Mill offers is at least something that is kind of in the middle. It's still an expensive strategy, and that is mostly going to be due to its lands. It's going to be the flooded strands, the polluted deltas, and things similar to that keep it expensive. But even some of its key pieces, the ones that make it tick, are going to be rather expensive as well now that people are picking up the deck. So right now, as of the recording of this video, it is approximately a $700 to $800 USD kind of TCG player deck. The great thing about this is if you're listening to this in an era of mana traders and rentals decks, it is approximately a 200 tick deck, approximately about that. So you should be able to get this with a mid-range mana traders account. And so that's going to be very appealing to a lot of people, being able to attack the Modern meta with a tier 1 strategy with, again, just a $30, $35 a month, being able to rent a deck like this out. So that's kind of covering the costs of it. Unfortunately, a lot of these pieces aren't really transferable, and that's one thing that has to be said. Archive Trap doesn't get played in anything other than Modern Mill. Visions of Beyond doesn't get played in anything other than Modern Mill. So these are going to be cards that this is going to be the type of strategy where it's very powerful, but if you get into it, ideally, this isn't really your first deck in Modern, and that's really what I would recommend. I wouldn't ever recommend this as a first intro deck to Modern. An intro deck to Modern would be something like Modern Burn, as an easy way to enter the strategy, have a very low to the ground linear concept, and use that to apply yourself and understand various interactions in the Modern format. Unfortunately, Modern Mill has some very intricate interactions, and so this isn't a way to enter Modern because of those intricate interactions as well. These cards don't transfer. So I really wanted to make sure that we touch base on the price and as well the transferability of some of the cards. You won't be able to take some of these cards in other strategies. Some you will. Drown in the Loch does get plays in Grixis Death Shadow and other Grixis base strategies, and then obviously you have the fetches, the removal, Luros of the Dream Den, the Ever-Present Companion. All of these cards are transferable. Some of the staples aren't. Now let's get into the core of Modern Mill. What makes Modern Mill tick? Now, the archetype, in a lot of ways, works with, well, primarily one type of creature, 8 creatures in total, and a bunch of sorceries and instants. It's a deck that's really spellcaster in a lot of ways, but opts to use these spells to interact with the opponent in an axis that, again, is extreme. They have to be extremely powerful and over the top to compete with what's going on the board state and an opponent's hand. The primary axis that Magic the Gathering is designed to work on is the battlefield, the graveyard, and the hand. Not a lot of interaction is based around the library. And that's one thing to keep in mind when we talk about some of these cards that may not seem as powerful off the rip, but provide a lot of extreme value once you start applying them and layering them on top of each other. The first card I want to talk about is going to be Hedron Crab. Hedron Crab is 1 blue mana for a 0/3 creature crab with a 0/2 creature crab with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Now, very easy mill card, a card that actually welcomes top decking lands. If this is a card on the battlefield, obviously being a 0/2, not a bad blocker, being able to block 1/1s and just chump anything more powerful, but again, welcomes land drops, which is actually a pretty powerful concept when you think about it. In the late game, when you tend to top deck lands, cards like this and the next card we're going to talk about welcome these top decks. So that's a nice axis to work on there. Again, extreme, creating value out of scenarios that aren't usually valuable to the average modern player. Ruin Crab is 1 blue mana for a 0/3 creature crab with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent, so unlike target player with Hedron Crab, which is going to be relevant for hexproof effects, Ruin Crab gets around hexproof effects such as Veil of Summer and Leyline of Sanctity by saying each opponent mills 3 cards. Now, Ruin Crab being one of the more recent innovations to the Modern Mill deck, being in a 0/3 body, very relevant against something like Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, and something like Unholy Heat, which only deals 2 damage without Delirium. The 0/3 body is actually very relevant. And then, again, getting around hexproof with the 3. Coming out of Zendikar Rising. So those are usually the 8 creatures that come out of a base Modern Mill deck. Going into the spells, we have the mill spells, instants and sorceries that provide us the value that we need. Archive Trap provides the combo control aspect. So the combo aspect of the combo control title that I wanted to put on this archetype. Archive Trap reads 3 and blue for an instant trap. That's right. Original Zendikar mechanic called Trap. Archive Trap. If an opponent searched their library this turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay Archive Trap's mana cost. So instead of paying 5, you pay 0. Target opponent puts the top 13 cards of their library into their graveyard. Now that's sweet. Now if you add that up, an opponent has 60 cards starting at the beginning of the game. Ideally, obviously, post-board, they might be playing 61. We're not thinking of Battle of Wits decks or other things that bad players play. We're thinking about a 60-card constructed deck. Now, after 60 cards, you open up, you draw 7 cards. Let's say your opponent keeps that. They are now at 53 cards. Archive Trap, if you have 4 Archive Traps in your opening hand, so Archive Trap, first one is 13. 2 Archive Traps is 26. 3 Archive Traps is 39 cards. And 4 Archive Traps is 52 cards. And your opponent has 53 cards in their deck. So essentially, once they go to draw their second card, if you manage to get all 4 of these Archive Traps out, they have no deck. They have 0 deck. You have essentially milled them out with 4 Archive Traps. And that is obviously the Exodia in a lot of ways of the modern format. This is truly one of the craziest opening hands that you can find in constructed competitive Modern right now. And it's extremely powerful. In a format full of fetch lands where people are actively searching their library to create optimal mana bases, make sure that they can play any spell that they need to at any given time, the format is a fetch-heavy format. We have cards such as Stoneforge Mystic, to search library for things like Colossus Hammer or other equipment such as Cauldron Complete. This is a card that can take advantage of that. If your opponent wants to tutor for things, so be it. You have the card you want, but I've won the game with these multiple archive traps. So this is the sole card that lends to the combo aspects of things. If you have multiple archive traps off the rip, then you are putting yourself in such a deep advantage in the start of the game. And obviously, there are deeper concerns such as opponents that play cards to play decks that use the graveyard an extension of their hand or use the graveyard as a resource. And I truly think those are two different style of strategies. Again, two style of decks that use the graveyard as an extension of their hand, i.e. Dredge, or use the graveyard as a resource. Think of something like Grixis Death Shadow or Murktide Regent. Use it for Delirium and a little bit of flashback. But again, not an extension of their hand. Anyway, those are deeper interactions that we can go into later. Archive Trap. The next card I want to talk about is going to be Tasha's Hideous Laughter. Now, Tasha's Hideous Laughter is a card that, as of the recording of this video, has truly put Modern Mill on the map. This was the big reason that Modern Mill right now is at least a tier 1.5 deck. It may not be one. Unfortunately, there's a lot of decks that push Mill out of the format right now, and we can talk about those later in terms of the matchup section. Tasha's Hideous Laughter reads 1 blue for a sorcery. Each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until that player has exiled cards with the total mana value of 20 or more. So essentially, you're just exiling, you're exile milling until you mill a total CMC of 20 or more. Now, I'm going to leave a link down below to the Mill Discord in the description box. Shout out to user Sleisenberger on the Mill Discord for coding in Python a very amazing program, honestly. A very simple piece of code that does a lot. The Tasha's Hideous Laughter Simulator. So what you can do in this Python code is actually input deck lists by amount of cards and CMC, and then input a Tasha's into it, and it'll give you the averages of and the kind of spread and range of the low end and the top end that Tasha's Hideous Laughter will give you. Well, surprise, surprise, for aggro strategies, especially decks that use Lurus of the Dream Den, the average CMC of the deck is approximately 1 or slightly lower than that. So you can imagine how deep you can actually go with Tasha's Hideous Laughter, sometimes 30 to 40 cards, depending on the archetype, in a modern meta filled with cards like Mishra's Bauble. Think about that. Remember that Mishra's Bauble is 0. We have cards such as suspend cards that are usually 0s. Think of Crashing Footfalls. Or you have lands at the end of the day. Lands are 0 CMC as well. It's not just going to be 21 drops. You're going to have some lands interspersed in there. So a lot of the times you are hitting a lot of cards with Tasha's Hideous Laughter. A card that truly allows us to take an angle against the aggro strategies, one that we've had to work for a long time by playing more life gain, more removal. But right now, a lot of times, it's really just cast Tasha's and win. So that's Tasha's Hideous Laughter. The next card I want to talk about is going to be Fractured Sanity. Fractured Sanity is a sorcery that came out of Modern Horizons 2, reads blue. That's right, 3 blue for a sorcery. Each opponent, again, you're seeing the thing such as Tasha's Hideous Laughter, Fractured Sanity, and Ruin Crab. Each opponent getting around hexproof effects and Veil of Summer. Each opponent mills 14 cards. So it's just 3 mana, 3 blue. Each opponent mills 14 cards. But the true use of this card is the cycling. So as we go down the card, it has cycling for 1 and a blue. Cycling reads, pay the cost, discard this card, and draw a card. So you pay 2 mana, discard, and just replace this card. When you cycle Fractured Sanity, each opponent mills 4 cards. Now, the power of this card is truly that at the top end, it provides you with a card that pays 3 mana to mill your opponent for 14. Pretty powerful. 1 more than an archive trap. So that can't be understated. That's approximately, if you think about a 60 card deck, that's approximately slightly under 25% of an opponent's deck. By the time they, draw their opening 7, it's more than 25%. So that's nothing to scoff at. If you think about paying an equivalent amount of mana, so if you brought it down by 1/3, again, I'm bringing that burn comparison, right? Even though we aren't a burn strategy, I think this is a very useful way to think about some of these cards. If I'm playing at a 60-point life total, think about this in terms of 20, right? So 20 is 1/3 of 60, right? I'm playing to 60 cards in an opponent's library. You're playing to 20 life, 1/3. If I bring down Fractured Sanity's cost by 1/3, right, to explain it to a lightning bolt, it's as if a lightning bolt dealt 5 damage, 1 mana for 5. That's essentially what Fractured Sanity is saying. That's pretty good. Now, the power of this card is the fact that you can cycle this away to replace it in the mid game. So you can play a draw go strategy where you can hold up 2 mana for cards that I'm going to later list, and then mill your opponent in such a way that's uncounterable. Now think about that. You're cycling this away. If your opponent does not have a stifle effect, a tail's end, they can't stop this mill. Now think about the advent of cards like Counterspell, Archmage's Charm, Force of Negation. They can't interact with the cycle effect. So if you're up against a control opponent and you're really grinding them out and they're getting low on cards and they start doing fun things like minusing a 5 mana Teferi to shuffle it back into their deck so that they don't have any more, so they keep drawing a card, they still have cards in the library, you can just cycle away Fractured Sanity, an uncounterable source of milling your opponent for 4. Now that's a pretty high floor for such a good card. That's Fractured Sanity. The next group of cards, we've actually covered all of the primary base mill cards. There's other mill cards that we can talk about, and we could go into them in a later section. But we're talking about the base deck right now. So I've talked about 4 Hedron Crabs, 4 Ruin Crabs, 4 Archive Traps, 4 Tashas, 4 Fractured. That is literally the base of your mill suite in a modern mill deck. Next up, I want to talk about some of the payoffs. Some of the reasons that mill is so powerful and some of the things that we can leverage. First and foremost, we should talk about the interaction. This is going to be some of the payoffs and what you get access to. And this is something that I alluded to a little bit earlier. And it's going to be surgical extraction. I laugh when I think about this card because it truly is one of the most powerful cards that exists in the modern format that only we can leverage as a mill archetype. Surgical Extraction reads 1 Phyrexian black mana. So for those of you unfamiliar with Phyrexian mana, it is a mana cost that can either be paid by one of the colors. So in this case, Phyrexian black mana, you can pay 1 black, 1 swamp, or 2 life. So you can think of it like a free spell in a lot of ways. Life is a resource. We're here to play to our outs. You can pay 2 life, it's a free spell. For an instant, choose target card in a graveyard other than a basic land card. Cool, you can choose non-basic lands like fetch lands as well. That's essentially what that's saying. Search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library. So again, all of the relevant zones that I mentioned earlier in the cast here that the modern meta plays to, other than the battlefield, I should say. The battlefield's probably the most important one. But we have other cards for that. Hand, library, and graveyard for any number of cards with the same name as that card. You're looking for the card that you target in the graveyard. You're looking for the same card. And exile all of them. Exile the ones from their hand, their graveyard, and their library. Then that player shuffles his or her library. Think about that for a second. This card gives Modern Mill a way to single-handedly neuter, dumpster, destroy, put on their back, sumo slam John Cena the Dam out of combo decks, big mana strategies, fragile decks that rely on 1 to 2 cards. Because once we mill over those cards on turn 1, on turn 2, I should say, actually. On turn 1, actually, with Archive Trap, if our opponent searches their library and I Archive Trap them for 0, because it costs 0. They search their library on turn 1 with the fetch land. I archive trap them. They're playing a combo deck that relies around 1 card, and that card gets milled over. I'm going to surgically extract that card for 0 mana, just 2 life. And I'm going to exile all copies of that card, making it so they no more have access to that card, and their deck is shut down. Mill has the ability to completely shut down these type of decks, which is why Mill has an extremely favored matchup against any combo strategy, any graveyard strategy, any big mana strategy in Modern. I'm thinking about Amulet Titan and Tron that rely on these key pieces to get there. Think about milling over a Tron land and then surgically extracting it. How fast do you think your opponent's going to get to Karn Liberated? That's right, 7 turns. They have to make 7 land drops to get to Karn Liberated, not 3, because we surgically extracted one of their Tron lands. Against the Storm opponent, what if you surgically extracted Past in Flames? They now don't have access to the cards in their graveyard. They cannot recast those cards in their graveyard, and their Storm strategy falls apart. Think about that. Surgical extraction, I'm going to say this again for the 3rd time, gives Modern Mill the ability to absolutely dumpster half. And that is fact. That is objective fact. Surgical extraction and similar cards such as Extirpate. I will let you look up Extirpate for those of you who are unaware. Extirpate is essentially an analog to surgical extraction, but different and better in some ways. Gives us the ability to have an extremely positive win rate and sometimes win-free games against half of the Modern meta. At least half. And that is what I'm saying is the start of truly understanding the power of Modern Mill, and that is surgical extraction. And so this is the type of a card that, depending on what's going on in the meta, we will play 4, sometimes 3, sometimes we'll just play it in the sideboard. If a meta is full of aggressive creature strategies such as Burn, Hammer Time, you could play surgical extraction against Hammer, or something like Modern Humans, then of course surgical extraction isn't going to be the best against those strategies because they play a strategy that is a mix of different powerful cards. Imagine trying to play surgical extraction against Modern Humans. You take out the meddling mages, oh well, they're just going to hit you with Mantis Riders. So evidently these are decks that play quantity versus quality. They don't play specific key cards, they play a bunch of good cards. So surgical extraction isn't great there. In a meta full of rhinos, in a meta full of Living End, in a meta full of any other combo deck, surgical extraction shines. The last payoff, or the second last payoff that I want to talk about is going to be Drown in the Loch. Now, Drown in the Loch is the next bit of interaction and is, again, truly we are one of the only decks that can truly take advantage of this card. Drown in the Loch is an instant that came out of Throne of Eldraine, probably the most busted set in Magic's history, in Magic's modern history. Drown in the Loch reads 1 blue, 1 black for an instant, a 2-mana instant. Choose 1. Counter target spell with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of cards in the spell's controller's graveyard. Or you can choose the second mode, destroy target creature with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. It's a counter spell tacked on to a terminated instant speed. It's a spell that is both a counter spell and a removal spell. Now think about that. A deck that is filling its opponent's graveyard. Drown in the Loch is legitimately going to be able to counter any spell. Obviously that isn't uncounterable, right? If a spell is uncounterable, it's uncounterable. All right. But any spell that is counterable, Modern Mill is going to leverage a graveyard board state that allows Drown in the Loch to destroy and counter. Destroy any creature on the battlefield and counter any spell. Any spell that your opponent presents at it. That, of course, is counterable. Thinking of cards like Dovin's Veto, which can't be countered. And obviously, creatures that are cast with Cavern of Souls, uncounterable. Perfectly fair. But again, Drown in the Loch, a key piece for Modern Mill, a way that provides leverage and multifaceted, allows us to create a interaction piece that is multifaceted, an interaction point that is multifaceted, I should say, where remembering that we are not a deck that plays to the board state. Obviously, Hedron Crab and Ruin Crab isn't traditionally playing to the board state, such as playing a creature and attacking with it or playing a Planeswalker. We're not a deck that plays hand disruption. So we have to create extreme value and work in interesting ways to create interactions and value points that are able to throw our opponents off in ways that they are unprepared for, such as Drown in the Loch, presenting us with a spell that can answer any one of our opponent's threats at any time should we have it available to us. And that is the power of Drown in the Loch. Finally, I'm going to be talking about the most powerful card in the modern deck. And true, and this is my subjective opinion, right? This might be one of those parts of the podcast that is a little bit subjective. I love this card. Visions of Beyond. Now, remember when I was talking about how Ancestral Recall is playable in Modern? Ancestral Recall is technically playable in Modern. It is a legal Magic card in Modern. You just have to play Mill. Now think about that. You get to play with the Power 9 in Mill. Just in Mill. No other deck gets to do that. Sure, play with your Lightning Bolt. Sure, play with your Thoughtseize. I get to play with Ancestral, one of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. And it goes by the name of Visions of Beyond. It disguises itself in Modern Mill. Now, Visions of Beyond reads 1 blue for an instant, draw a card. If an opponent has 20 or more cards in their graveyard, if an opponent's graveyard has 20 or more cards, if a graveyard, if even your graveyard, because your opponent's milling you out or your opponent's stopping all your spells, if your graveyard or your opponent's graveyard, any graveyard, has 20 or more cards in it, draw 3 cards instead. Woo! Let's go. Again, as a strategy that looks to put cards from an opponent's deck into the graveyard, you can imagine how easily this card can be activated. How easily a game state can be created where this card is now drawing 3 cards every time you cast it, where you are able to chain together multiple Visions of Beyond to draw 3, 6, 9 cards in one turn, just off the power of Modern Mill. And that's Visions of Beyond. Truly, I think, again, one of the most powerful spells, the most powerful spell that Visions of Beyond has, Modern Mill has access to. Arguably, you could say Surgical Extraction is just as equally powerful as a payoff. But again, that is going to be one of those cards that you are definitely playing a 4 of. And I wanted to now take this further section to talk about some other payoffs that the Modern deck has. And before I get into that, I want to talk about the next caveat. This might be caveat number 56 because I've listed so many at this point. In my subjective opinion, it's hard to make objective opinions these days, but in my subjective opinion, I believe that if you are playing a Mill deck that does not play a play set of Hedron Crab, Ruin Crab, Archive Trap, Tasha's Hideous Laughter, and Fractured Sanity, as of the recording of this podcast. Now, obviously, if better cards are printed by the time you're listening to this, if the Modern meta becomes so extreme that we print another Hogak, blah, 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 okay. Other than that, if you're not playing these cards as a play set, you are not playing this deck correctly. Next up, I think in Dimir Mill, you should be playing a playset of Drown in the Loch, because again, that is one of the most powerful payoffs that Dimir Mill has access to. You should be playing 4 Visions of Beyond. I've seen people shaving copies of Visions of Beyond, and I think that is absorbently incorrect. I think if you are shaving copies of Visions of Beyond to play other cards, I think you're trying to solve a problem or deal with matchups that aren't giving you enough percentage points with that card you're replacing the 4th Visions of Beyond with, and aren't giving you enough percentage points to where Visions of Beyond could give you. Don't play Modern Mill with less than 4 Visions of Beyond, just like how you would not play Modern Burn with less than 3 Lightning Bolts. Just stating the obvious. And just like Surgical Extraction, as the recording of this video, I've had some people who don't know what they're talking about, that call themselves good Magic players but just don't understand what mill is, tell me that Surgical Extraction is not a good Magic card. And again, anyone listening to this video, I implore you to play this deck, goldfish it, and see what Surgical Extraction does against half of the modern meta. Like I said, half of the modern meta. And you'll truly understand how easily you can shut down decks. The way I compare this is, again, comparing this to Burn. I'm bringing a lot of analogs to Burn, even though I'm not saying that this deck is Burn. But it seems to be the easiest way that people understand this. Would you play Modern Burn in a competitive scenario without Eidolon of the Great Revel? A card that can be dead against a lot of matchups. Won't provide you a lot of value. Might hurt you more than it hurts the opponent. Especially against something like a Vial strategy or a Tron strategy where they're actually just playing a lot of high CMC stuff. They may not actually play a lot of low CMC stuff. They may play one or two, whatever. Would you play Burn without Eidolon of the Great Revel? No, you wouldn't. You'd be absolutely daft for doing so. Same thing with Surgical Extraction. If you don't have Surgical Extraction, at least as a 3-of, in your 75, so not even in your main board, there are going to be metas where the graveyard is so powerful that we need to remove all copies of cards from graveyard. So Surgical Extraction might actually be replaced with cards like Soul Guy Lantern, Tormod's Crypt, and you might actually play those cards in the main board because the graveyard is so powerful. But if you do not have Surgical Extraction in your main board, you are playing mill wrong, and you are giving up free wins to solve matchups that aren't that favored with the cards you are replacing Surgical Extraction with. You are making matchups unfavorable, more matchups unfavorable than you are making other matchups favorable or winnable. Play Surgical Extractions, play Visions of Beyond, play Drown in the Loch, and you'll be fine. Please. Next, I want to talk about some of the off payoffs. Some of the other cards that get played in Modern Mill, and why we would want to play them. So, with the current state of Modern as they're recording this podcast, it's a very one-drop centric format. Lots of Dragon's Rage Channelers, Colossus Hammers, low to the ground artifacts, Ragavans, whatever it might be. Lots of low to the ground creatures. So Fatal Push currently is a staple of this deck. Obviously, being in Dimir, this is probably the best removal spell that Black has access to in Modern. I think a lot of people can agree with that. The printing of Fatal Push changed the Modern environment, made cards like Tarmogoyf a lot more irrelevant in a way, a lot more solvable in that sense. So Fatal Push is a very powerful card. You will probably be playing 4 copies of this card right now. You would probably have to if you want to win a lot of games, just so you have a chance of having it in your opening hand. The next card I want to talk about is going to be Crypt Incursion. And I think this is probably going to be one of the last cards I talk about in the main board in terms of payoffs, just because there's so many cards we could get into, but a lot of them, I would argue, could also just be sideboard cards that you bring in post board. So I'm going to talk about Crypt Incursion. Crypt Incursion reads 1 black, 2 colorless. Sorry, I didn't read Fatal Push, but y'all are listening to a Modern podcast. You know what Fatal Push is. Come on now. Crypt Incursion. 1 black, 2 colorless for a 3 mana instant. Black instant at common. Not that expensive. Exile all creature cards from target player's graveyard. You gain 3 life for each card exiled that way. Think about what this card does against humans, merfolk, current Luros Jund, not Boomer Jund, Liliana, Luros Jund. Think about what this does. If you mill over a modern human player's deck, let's say you cast an archive trap for free because somehow you got them to search, their library. We can talk about some of the lands that can actually do that against a modern humans deck that doesn't traditionally search. We'll talk about some of the land payoffs. You get them to search that library. You mill over 13 cards. How many creatures do you think you're going to mill over? A deck that plays 18 to 19 lands, 4 vials. That's approximately like 30 plus creatures, right? If you're not talking about anything else that's spicy, that's 30 plus creatures. there's a good chance that you're going to be milling over a ton of creatures for Crypt Incursion to cast. And every creature that Crypt Incursion exiles, you gain 3 life for. There have definitely been 100% live on my streams and any other mill creator streams where they have cast Crypt Incursion for 60, 70, 80, 90 plus life against a tribal strategy. And I don't care how many how many Lord of Atlantis you have. If I spend 3 mana to gain 90 life, I have set you back so far. And that's what Crypt Incursion provides. And you start to see how the various aspects of Modern Mill lend to a very powerful strategy. Let's start tying some of this together. Archive Trap punishes decks for searching their library in a fetch format. Drown in the Loch punishes decks for putting cards into their graveyard, such as the Murktide decks or the Grixis Death Shadow decks, and allowing us to counter and kill all their spells and their creatures. You then have cards like Surgical Extraction, which absolutely eat half of the modern meta. You want to talk about some? Again, I'll relist them. Crashing Footfalls. What happens when you surgical away Crashing Footfalls the card? The combo is gone. Surgical Extraction, Living End. The combo is gone. Let's talk about Amulet Titan. How about you surgical, literally Primeval Titan? What's the deck going to do from there? What if you surgical away Urza's Tower? What is Tron going to do from there? Again, highlighting that there's so many decks that Mill beats with various pieces coming together. And then finally, I'm missing that last card, Tasha's Hideous Laughter against Hammer Time. A deck that plays 4 Ornithopters at 0. 4 Ornithopters at 0s, 23 lands that cost 0. So many spells that cost 1 mana. I'm talking about Colossus Hammer, Esper Sentinel, sometimes other like random 1-drops as well. All of these cards that are very low to the ground. Think about how much you're going to mill with Tasha's Hideous Laughter. And you start to create a package where the deck leverages extreme interaction, extreme and really unnatural ways of interacting with the modern meta to leverage some of the most powerful game states and stack pieces that you can put together to a win. It's truly something to behold. Now, finally, one of the last things that I want to go over in terms of the individual cards for Modern Mill is going to be the lands. So, a lot of it is going to be pretty cut and dry. You do want to be playing at least 7 to 8 fetches, and that's going to be some mix. Again, in Dimir, you want 4 polluted deltas, and then the rest of it is going to be coming into some mix of blue fetches. So traditionally, the deck has been playing Flooded Strands to kind of feint playing control decks. You could also mix them up if you're worried about the Mill Mirror, where your opponent might surgical away your lands. You might want to be playing a mix of something like Polluted Delta or Misty Rainforest to help creep a variety of fetches, but obviously you want the Polluted Deltas. You then play some level of basics to help play around Blood Moon and create fetchables. Some of the other cards that we want to play are things like obviously Watery Grave and not Shelldock Isle, sorry, not yet, but Darkslick Shores. So Darkslick Shores provides us fast mana in a way that's not painful, and that's one of the key reasons why we play it. It gives us access to a Watery Grave that's unfetchable, but doesn't shock us when we play it, so giving us access to our colors against tougher matchups like Humans, like Burn, where we need very key pieces to resolve at key times. So having that 2 extra life, that 4 extra life, maybe off the second Darkslick Shores is going to be very important. One of the key lands that gets plays in the strategy is Field of Ruin. Field of Ruin is a colorless land. You can tap it to add 1 colorless mana. Okay. Or you can pay 2 taps, sacrifice Field of Ruin, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. Each player searches their library. So that's you and your opponent. Right? You sack the Field of Ruin, it gets replaced. You destroy your opponent's non-basic land. So you can't destroy base. You destroy your opponent's non-basic land, they get to replace it. Each player searches their library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield, and then shuffles. The key thing you need to take away from this Field of Ruin, folks, remember Archive Trap? How you get to pay 0 for it and mill your opponent for 13, 26, 39, or 52 if you have all of them, if they search their library. Field of Ruin doesn't say may search their library like Ghost Quarters does. Field of Ruin forces your opponent to search. Even if they don't have a basic to find, even if they don't want to put a basic onto the battlefield, they have to search their library. They have to. So then the Archive Trap is just enabled from there. You start getting into some sweet lines where you can play your Field of Ruin as a third land per turn. You can crack it, take away an opponent's land. You then bring back a island on your turn. You mill your opponent over for 13 cards. They probably have 20 or more cards in their graveyard. You use that one blue you have left to cast Visions of Beyond. You've drawn 3 cards, and then maybe you start drawing into more Archive Traps. You cast those as well. You start getting into some very powerful sequences once you start getting engines going. Once you start double spelling every turn, and that's part of that whole combo control aspect, where once you are able to deploy threats and able to deploy cards that create friction for your opponent and back them up or create further game states or set yourself up for the future. That's where the deck shines. That's where you're going to be able to secure those wins out of nowhere. That's where you're going to be able to lock your opponent out of the game because they literally just don't have any cards left to play or access to the cards you've put away. So that's Field of Ruin. The last card I want to talk about really is going to be Shelldock Isle. This is the second last land that I want to talk about. Sorry. And I wanted to say there are a bunch of lands that I could talk about, but again, want to talk about the primary one. Shelldock Isle is a hideaway land. It's part of the hideaway cycle. So it's a blue land, Shelldock Isle specifically. Hideaway. It says this land comes into play tapped. When it does, look at the top 4 cards of your library, remove one of them from the game face down. So exile it face down, and then put the rest at the bottom of your library. Okay, so in any order. You put it at the bottom of your library in any order. So you look at the top 4 cards of your library, you exile 1 card under Shelldock Isle, and it enters tapped. You can tap it to add 1 blue to your mana pool. So Shelldock Isle does pay for mana. Cool. The last ability is you can pay 1 blue, tap it. You may then play the removed card without paying its mana cost if a library, yours or your opponent, so this works in the mill mirror too. If you're getting milled out a lot, you can then cast this too. If a library has fewer than 20 cards in it. So this type of land helps you find that payoff for later in the game. Let's say you're milling your opponent away, you're milling them, you got your Archive Traps, you got your Hedron Crabs, but they're starting to threaten a board presence against you, and you got that Shelldock Isle, you got them under 20 cards, well, guess what? You're going to be able to pay blue, tap this, and you get to cast the card underneath it without paying its mana cost, and you get to get around timing restrictions. This allows you to cast sorceries at instant speed. This allows you to cast creatures at instant speed. This allows you to cast all these spells at instant speed. You can cast Hedron Crabs for supply prize blockers. You can cast Tasha's Hideous Laughter at instant speed. You can just cast the Archive Trap underneath it for 1 blue instead of 5. That is the power of Shelldock Isle. Giving you that final end piece of the mill deck. The last card I want to talk about, the last land that I want to talk about is going to be Aboro. And Aboro is going to be one of the staple one-ofs of the deck, just because of Hedron Crab and Ruin Crab. Now imagine a board state where you aren't drawing any more lands. You aren't flooding. You've reached the pinnacle of Magic. You have found a way to find all the lands you need and just draw spells. But you have Hedron Crabs and Ruin Crabs on the battlefield. How do you make those worth it? How do you make those useful? Well, Aboro is a legendary blue land that reads tap, add 1 blue to your mana pool, so it does tap for mana. And then its second ability is pay 1, return Aboro to its owner's hand. Now remember that Hedron Crab and Ruin Crab have landfall triggers. Now landfall is very easily triggerable if you just have a land that keeps bouncing back to your hand. So every turn that you don't draw land, you have an Aboro, draw your card, oh, it's not a land, okay, return Aboro to your hand, pay 1 with Aboro, tap it, pay 1, create a blue, and then use that blue to pay for the 1 colorless, because that 1 colorless doesn't require you to sack or tap Aboro, it's just pay 1. Return Aboro to your hand, play it as a landfall. Play it as your landfall, and now it's just an untapped blue source, and you get to trigger your Ruin Crab. So obviously a staple of the deck because of the Hedron and Ruin Crabs. And that is really the majority of the main board of the deck. And I think that's really where I want to go. I think there's one card that I want to mention in the sideboard, but this is really going to come to a close as to the primary cards in the mill strategy. right? And then after this, I'm going to start going into some matchups and really kind of further cement some of the things I was talking about with beating half the modern metagame, and then really talk about some of the bad matchups that Mill has and some of the concepts that we can apply, which will then help kind of cement the things I was saying in the beginning, where we are a combo control decks, but we do lose to certain type of strategies, helping you to further solidify the pros and cons of the deck, and maybe getting you to make a decision on whether or not you want to play this. So the last card I want to mention is going to be Luros the Dream Den. Now, obviously, the companion mechanic is a very controversial mechanic in Magic as a whole, and for Modern, of course. Luros is a very polarizing card, and what we're thankful for Luros in general is that it's a card that we stand to lose the least if it does get banned. We're not the type of strategy that necessarily hinges on it, but of course, we very easily can warp our deck around it, because really the only permanents that we play that are 3 CMC and less is Hedron Crab, and they're all 1. So that's perfectly fine. Luros of the Dream Den, providing us the ability to recast our Hedron Crabs and Ruin Crabs. I actually briefly mentioned Soul Guide Lantern. Allows us to recast our Soul Guide Lanterns out of our graveyard to then play those over and over again. Also provides us with a lifelink piece against some of the aggro strategies that we have a very hard time against. So all in all, a very useful companion. One that does end up getting cast every so often, but may not be used every single game, because sometimes you just get there with the other spells, and that's perfectly fine. Now that ends the section that I want to use to talk about some of the cards in the Modern Mill Archetype. And I want to use these kind of final sections right here to talk about matchups in Modern. Let's go over some of the more common matchups in the Modern meta, and then we can use that to then talk about, well, what's good and what's bad. Further help solidify pros and cons, as I said. So as the recording of this video, I'm just going to go through the top 10 decks in the Modern meta right now. Top 10. So Hammer Time. Positive matchup for Mill. Exorbitantly positive. Because you just cast Tasha's Hideous Laughter and you milled them for literally 35 cards. 3 mana mill 35. By turn 3, think about how many cards you've already milled them for. You've cast a Hedron Crab. You made multiple land drops with your fetch lands. You've cast an Archive Trap because maybe they've searched with a Stoneforge Mystic. They're pretty much already at half. You cast a Tasha's Hideous Laughter. They've lost the rest of the game. Bang, bang. You can even help with Tasha's Hideous Laughter against this deck. For example, you can cast a Surgical Extraction targeting the Stoneforge Mystic, because Stoneforge Mystic is targeting the Pure Steel Paladin. Pure Steel Paladin is a 2 CMC permanent. If they mill one over, surgical that away, and then the other 3 copies of the Pure Steel Paladin that are in their deck get exiled, which means Tasha's doesn't have to read them, which means the average CMC of their deck actually increasing the amount of cards they can actually mill over with Tasha's. So now you start getting into some of the intricacies, some of the cool interactions that you get access to with something like Surgical Extraction plus other cards, with Tasha's Hideous Laughter plus other cards. So that's Hammer Time. Next up is going to be Yorion Blink. Now this is going to be generally the type of strategy that Mill isn't really favored against. This is the Yorion Blink decks, in a lot of ways, is a mid-range deck. It's a deck that leverages interaction and cheap, a lot of times free, interaction and power, and a lot of per card value, such as cards like Icefang Coatl, Omnath Locus of Creation, or Renin 6, to leverage a tempo card advantage against us. And that's the type of thing that we can't really beat. They tempo us better. They mid-range us better. That's perfectly fine. You got to lose to something. This is a type of matchup that's very hard, especially because it has access to Endurance in the sideboard, and sometimes we'll play Emrakul the Promised End. Or, sorry, Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. Promised End is fine. Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, which shuffles away. Next up, the next matchup that I want to talk about is going to be Grixis Death Shadow. Again, another strategy that generally is unfavored for Mill. This is going to be the type of strategy that opts to leverage very cheap, interactive pieces and very powerful threats. A deck that demands an answer to every single spell that it plays at every stage in the game. Unfortunately, cards like Drown Unlock being 2 CMC, lining up against threats like Death Shadow that are 1, you can start to understand how interaction pieces like this don't really line up in terms of mana. 2 mana is literally double the cost of 1 mana. So you can start to see how they can implement cards like Thoughtseize or Inquisition or Kozilek to get rid of our cheaper interaction pieces to then force us to cast our higher interaction pieces, which they can deal with after. It's a deck that, again, just like the Blink decks, just like the Yorion decks, can tempo us out, mid-range us out better. So that's perfectly fine. Murktide Regent being the next deck that I want to talk about is going to be the Delver deck of the format. The deck hoping to leverage threats, cheap interactive counter magic. This is a type of strategy that, again, is unfavored for the deck, but I think is pretty close. I think it's about 49% win rate for us, maybe 45. It's very close. Where if you can leverage some good play and some interactive pieces such as Extirpate, Surgical Extraction, primarily the big problem for Murktide for Mill is going to be Murktide Regent. That's the type of card that's very difficult for us to deal with because it has the Delve mechanic. Delve exiles cards from an opponent's graveyard, and our one answer to this card in the main board is going to be Drown in the Loch. Now, if you're exiling cards when the opponent's exiling cards from their graveyard, Drown starts losing his value more and more and more. So Murktide is actually a perfect answer, being a 7-mana permanent. Exiling cards from a graveyard, the Drown in the Loch starts getting a lot less value. So if you're able to surgical it away, extirpate it away, well, first and foremost, as we were mentioning with Hammer Time, the average CMC of the deck decreases. So then you're going to be able to toss this Hideous Laughter for much more value. And then your Drown in the Lochs can then just focus on answering Ragavans, Dragon Channeler, whatever it might be. That's pretty nice in itself. Now, Burn. Again, very, very, traditionally one of the worst matchups. One of the worst matchups for the modern meta. One of the worst matchups. And this is going to be very tough because I think Modern Mill as an archetype is at the point where we are not bothering to answer Burn anymore. It's such an exorbitantly bad matchup that we are leaving it to archetypes such as Esper Mill, Azorius Mill, that have access to better sideboard pieces in white to help answer Burn. Dimir Mill, not so great. I'm at the point where I would highly recommend not having pieces for Burn and just accepting the loss. Crashing Footfalls, favored for Mill. Crashing Footfalls, get rid of the combo and then just mill them. They're going to have to slow you down with cards such as Fury or Brazen Borrower. You obviously have to have answers for the endurances, which they have, and that might be tough if they're playing endurance main board, and especially if they bring in Blood Moon post board, but you're going to have cards like Soul Guide Lantern and Tormod's Crypt, whatever you might be playing post board to help answer the endurance, which means once you get rid of the combo, you have an answer to endurance, you're just going to keep milling them out. You're going to be perfectly fine. So that's going to be the Crashing Footfall strategy. Control. Azorius Control. Number 7 on the top 10, Azorius Control and Control in general historically has been very favored for Modern Mill. Control is going to be the type of strategy that unfortunately has to use interaction pieces to deal with cards like Hedron Crab, and we can force them to tap out, answer at pieces, and cast free spells such as Archive Traps once they do answer these cards. We can then leverage pieces such as Fractured Sanity, which is uncounterable draw mill, to then beat out and finish out Azorius Control players. There's a lot of aspects to why Control is favored for Mill, but this is a super favored deck. So again, 5 matchups that are bad, 2 matchups that are good. Yawgmoth, favored matchup for Mill, a creature-centric combo strategy. So we have cards like Crypt Incursion for the creature side. We have cards like Surgical Extraction for the combo side. You can see how we picked that part out. Amulet Titan, highly favored deck. Mill is one of the worst matchups historically for Amulet Titan, and any Amulet Titan player will tell you that. If they do not tell you that, they are wrong and they don't know what they're talking about. Mill is one of the worst matchups for Amulet Titan, and they have to make choices in their sideboard and make their sideboard weaker against other strategies just to try and play against us. Amulet Titan's great. Just surgical away the Primeval Titan, and they're done. Jund historically has been a bad matchup for us, but the new version of Jund with Luros is actually a favored matchup for us because they opt for a more creature-centric threat package, ones that gets answered to Fatal Push, gets answered by Drown in the Loch, and gets answered by Crypt Incursion. Previously, they would play cards like Liliana the Veil, which are very tough for us to deal with, and Bloodbraid Elf, which is a higher CMC permanent that can cast other spells, so double spelling and tempoing us much better than we can do to them. So again, a strategy that got much easier for us to deal with once they started playing Luros of the Dream Den. So I would say a favorite matchup right now. Next up, the last matchup that we get to talk about is going to be Blue Living End. Now, Blue Living End, again, a matchup that is very favored for us. I would say very favored for us. It's going to be a matchup that really only has Force of Negation to help leverage any type of control against you. So you have to play around when they try and combo off on your turn, but you're going to have the cheap interactive counter spells such as Mystical Dispute, such as Surgical Extraction, which is technically free, so you can have the mana for your other interaction pieces to deal with Living End. Once you deal with Living End, they're going to have to start hard casting their threats to do anything to you because they've cycled away so many of their threats into their graveyard and they have no access to them at all after that. So cards like Violent Outburst, and Shardless Agent essentially just become dead. They don't do anything else in the deck once you Surgical away Living End. The thing that's tough about this deck is this deck will play only 3 copies of Living End because it really only needs to find Violent Outburst and Shardless Agent. And when a deck plays less than 4 copies of a card that you need a Surgical, obviously it can be tougher to find it. That is one less copy that's not going to get milled over and you won't be able to find. So that can be pretty tough there. So again, as I've outlined, 5 matchups. We just look at the top 10 meta decks in the format. 5 matchups that are bad, 5 matchups that are good. Modern Mill is the type of deck that can leverage these type of matchups and make plays with Surgical Extraction, with Drowning the Lock, with Tasha's Hideous Laughter to leverage plus and minuses against some of these decks. If you go further into these matchups, Dredge is an extremely favored matchup for Mill. Dredge is a joke. Mill players will beat up on Dredge all the time. Green Tron, that's a joke. Belcher, that's a joke. Grix's Jeskai Control, yeah, it can be a little bit better. Their interaction pieces are a little bit more aggressive, but we can beat that as well. These are all strategies that have seen play through the history of Modern, and we absolutely dumpster because of some of the unique strategy and interaction pieces that Modern Mill presents, and you have to be playing them. Now, a lot of more recent decks and recent Mill decks have been opting to not play cards such as Surgical Extraction or Drown in the Lock, and no comment. That's all I'll say. So now what I want to do is end off this episode of the podcast with really just rounding off some of the concepts that we've listed. What you'll notice is this is really just like a one-take podcast. I've actually not edited anything in the middle. This is literally just one continuous take. I've been talking for an hour straight. Applause to me. Now, what are some of the concepts that we've listed? Modern Mill is a control combo tempo style strategy. Looking to leverage interaction pieces such as Drown in the Lock, Surgical Extraction to interact with the opponent with cards like Tasha's Hideous Laughter and Archive Trap in a combo aspect to mill over so many cards in the library and leverage such a overwhelming advantage in terms of the grind game that way that we can get the W, that we can get the win. We can use Surgical Extraction to Surgical away key combo pieces against decks and completely shatter them. We can use cards like Tasha's Hideous Laughter to completely decimate aggro decks that play low CMC and cards that are low to the ground. We can use Archive Traps against greedy decks such as such as Yorian Blink, or 5-color decks such as Crashing Footfalls, or can seem like 5-color decks that fetch aggressively with Archive Trap to punish them for doing things like that, for finding the mana they need, for finding the cards they need. We can punish them for doing things like that. Modern Mill has a lot of positive aspects to it. Obviously, a lot of negative. There's a lot of mid-range decks in the format that do beat up on Mill. They do tempo us. They do mid-range us better than we can mid-range them. But the positives of the deck allow us to leverage the rest of the format. And that is ultimately kind of the pros and cons of Mill. I've gone over the individual matchups, the individual cards, and really just in broad strokes. So I'm hoping you can provide this as a really kind of soft primer, an in-depth piece for anyone looking to get into the Modern Mill archetype and use this as a way to kind of convince someone why they would want to get into Mill and help them to understand what the Mill matchup really is, because this can probably be used as a way to how to beat Modern Mill, but that's another topic. I'm not teaching y'all how to do that. That's fine. Anyway, we're going to end off this that episode of the podcast there. Let's just go into some post-episode stuff here. In terms of updates, what I'm doing right now is I am trying to make a big push for general Modern content on the YouTube channel. So if you wanted to check that out, I've been posting a lot of shorts. I'd really appreciate some of that. Follow me on TikTok as well. And I've been posting some non-Mill gameplay as well, as in some Mill adjacent stuff. I've been playing Dimir Rogues. As of recording this video, I wanted to give everyone a heads up that I will probably start be playing some Ad Nauseam as well, because you're realizing that Ad Nauseam is just like reverse mill. You're milling yourself and then playing Thassa's Oracle. So obviously that seems kind of dirty, but seems kind of fun. I've never actually piloted the deck before, and I want to kind of expand my horizons and keep a lot of the mill gameplay to the streams. And for those of you on YouTube catching me there, you'll get some mill gameplay, but you'll get some non-mill gameplay as well. So just keeping things varied. Other than that, super excited for the releasing episodes of Book of Boba Fett. That's been pretty sick. And then this last season of The Witcher has been like pretty sweet as well. And I'm really just like waiting on Elden Ring at this point. I pre-ordered Elden Ring and I cannot wait. I'm a big Dark Souls fan. I think Dark Souls 1 has one of the I think subjectively Dark Souls 1 has the best designed map and exploration system I've ever seen in a game like it. I've ever seen. It's a map that is so interesting, so involved, has so many different pathways and ways to connect in different areas. It is truly one of the best things I've ever seen designed. So I can't wait for that to get further extrapolated through Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, which I played, and then into Elden Ring. I haven't gotten to play the recent Demon Souls remake because it's console exclusive, but give it some years. They'll bring it to PC. I'm not a console scrub. But anyway, let's end it off there. Thanks everyone for hanging out. Hopefully next episode we can have our glorious co-host back, Jack, aka Blitz MTG. And I don't know, talking to myself for an hour is rather tiring. My vocal cords are wrecked, let me tell you. But thanks everyone for hanging out. Follow me on my socials down below. And of course, let me know what I missed in this episode. What are some concepts that I can touch on in maybe a future episode of a continuation of this episode? Or again, what are some things that I've said wrong that I should address in further episodes going forward? But thank you everyone for hanging out. Hopefully you stay safe in these crazy times. And yeah, I don't know. I guess I should say my outro, but we're just going to say bye-bye. Later.